Well, hello, if anyone is out there in the Twitch. So, I'll get started with this. In the past video, the past stream, I was preparing episode 36, which will be about, I don't remember, let me check. Yeah, making things more object-oriented. So what I did was started to transform the entities to not be just bags of properties, and moved some logic into the entities, playing around with EF core and doing things to make sure that we can persist stuff, all works well, but the logic is now in the entities, so we can put the logic inside each entity. So this is ready, so for me to record this video and create this blog post. But as I won't do that here, I'm going to start preparing episode 37 and the others next to that, which will be about making better use of types. And I will be using a bunch of things. I don't know how many of them I'll do today, but basically we'll do some changes to avoid as many exceptions using return types, results instead. We'll start to try to avoid null, returning null from things using the optional object. And besides that, also strongly typed IDs instead of using ints and longs and all that stuff. Like if we go here, for instance, just update group command, and everything is, the user ID is a string, the group ID is a long, and it's not very type safe. So we'll make some changes. Let's see how many of them we'll do today during the stream. So I don't know, I was thinking starting with the optional, but maybe I'll start with the result. No, I'll start with the optional because so there are a ton of implementations, and other languages have optional out of the box. C# doesn't. So when I did some presentation in the meetup in the last year, I created a very basic version of an optional. So I'll start with that. I think I want to put that in another project, but for now I'll just create a new folder here and then extract it. Shared. So I'll copy this part and I'll even copy this. I'm copying my own code, so okay, so for now I'm going to start with this basic implementation of optional. Then I'll maybe eventually add more stuff, but for now it will do. So what's the idea for this optional thing? And I won't be using it in the perfect way, because the perfect way is more functional and it works, but it's not really. Sometimes the code gets weird because it's C#, not a functional language. But the idea of optional is to avoid returning nulls when we want to say that nothing is there. So imagine that we are making a request to get the user by ID, and the user by ID with that ID doesn't exist. And normally what we do is we return null. But the problem is with that, we must always check that it's if it is or not null. We might forget, and it's not great. And if we did it really functionally, we would even, instead of doing checks if it's the value is there or not, we would be able to like link chain calls to multiple methods without worrying about that. I don't know if we are going to go with that approach. We'll start simple. Eventually, maybe we go with that approach. So the idea is with the optional, we have something, so some or none. So when it's none, it means that there is no value in there. Instead of being a null, there is an optional that says no value here. And when there is some, there is a value there. So the implementation is very basic, but basically we have a flag indicating if there's a value and the actual value. Then I have this has value. There's a constructor which is internal for it just to be used by this by the static helper methods. And then we have some helper methods here, which is like value var. So we can do something like if we return the optional, when we get an optional, we can get the actual object that's in there, or if there is no value, we can use a factory to generate a value. This is common to use. This try get value is me thinking that it's interesting. Just using the same kind of thinking that we use, for instance, in dictionaries when we want to grab a value that we don't know if it's in there. So the optional, it's kind of like that. We don't know if it's in there, so we can use try get value. One important thing is that we cannot access the value directly. We always must go through these helper methods. So the idea is that if we allowed the value to be accessed directly, we probably could end up in the same situation where people just would go there and without checking and then get a null reference exception. So the idea of the optional is to get rid of null reference exceptions. So if we can minimize it by enforcing rules, we should. So this is a very basic implementation. So we can then maybe, probably not today, but enrich this implementation with methods that help us to chain calls. So if there's an object, it will call the next one. If not, it would just return immediately, something like that. But not for today. So for today, we'll keep it simple and get rid of nulls. So where do we have a null? Get user group detail is probably a good candidate. Let's check. Exactly. So we have here, we have this query where we are trying to get a user by ID and or a group for a group by user ID and group ID. And if there isn't, we just check if it's null. Instead, we'll change this to, instead of returning a group, it will return an optional group. And this also makes it explicit. It also makes it explicit that there might not be a group instead of having to assume. So if we start, in all the code base, we start assuming that the nulls won't be returned like this, So we'll be able to assume that if it returns an optional, then it may or may not exist. But if we return the actual type directly, it never can be null. So that's the idea. So now we have this exception, this compilation error, because group is a struct, so it can never be null. Sorry, optional is a struct, so it can never be null, which ends up being nice for this. So this is an optional group. What we can do in this case, for instance, we could, where this is used, let's go here to the, we will change this, but for now let's do it like this. In the groups controller, when we get by ID, we do this. So we'll change this to return optional. This won't be the final way, but we can do if okay, so this is complaining because it's different. Okay, so we can do something like this. If there is a group, we say okay, otherwise it's not found. So over here, we can rename this to maybe group, because we are not sure. And we can do that. This I think is a good place to, let's do the basic way, then we'll check out an alternative. Maybe group. Can return optional of none when it's what's going on. Okay. Forgot this part. Now it works. Now I can use the group over here. Optional, some, we don't need this. So the code right now is exactly the same as it was before, but instead of checking for nulls, we use the optionals. And like I mentioned, the idea is that we avoid null reference exceptions, because when there is something, we can check it. When there isn't, so when there is something, it will return without the optional. No need to do ifs. But when it's possible to not have something, we do this. But the code is exactly the same. So one thing we can do, let's go here to the shared again. I'll create something in here. Maybe later I'll organize it better. But now public static class optional extensions. We can do public static optional of the out. Call it map. Of the in, the out, and we'll get an optional of the in, which will be these. And we'll use a func turns the out that gets the in, the out. Okay, so the idea is we'll have a maybe value, so an optional, and if there is a value, we'll map it with this mapper. If there isn't, we'll just return the optional empty of the out. So to do this, we can just use if maybe value, try get value, in fact even shorter, we return optional sum of mapper value, otherwise optional, this is weird, optional none t out. Okay, if we do it this way, what we can do is, instead of doing it like this, we can just do return optional maybe group dot map Okay, so now by using this extension method, instead of doing ifs, no need to do ifs, I can just do return map, because it's really simple code. Otherwise I would need some more logic, but because I'm just checking this out, I can just maybe group map this. And now that I'm thinking about it, we can go to the controller again. We could, let me check. We can create more extension methods, but it would be the same, so let's leave it like this for now. But we could create an extension method that got a function for when it's successful and a function when it's not successful. But the code would be basically the same, so for now let's leave it. Okay, so cleaner, because it was simple anyway. Okay, so now we have some errors in other places because they're checking probably user group query returns an optional group. And the same here. Okay, so now we have the error over here, but now it's not as simple, because in this one, because the only thing we needed was to return if there's a group or not, we could get away with it by just using the, by just using, not this one, where is that, that. So we could just get away with returning an optional here. But the other ones is a different story, because we need to do logic afterwards. So if we don't go into the logic, so in this case, this is easy to resolve. This is the delete. The delete is easy because we don't need to return nothing special. We just need to do this. So this is solved. But the update group is another thing. Because if we get here and there is no group, right now we're returning null. Okay, so in this case we could also just change this to return an optional. But instead, let's start looking at the other things, which will be add class result. And the idea with this result is not only getting rid of nulls like the optional, but to use in cases like I mentioned in this beginning, because I want to make this more better use of types. We can use this to avoid throwing exceptions and really saying to the client of the code that this can return a success, or can it can fail because of this or this. So we can use a result. I also use this in that presentation. I'll copy it, even though maybe some things will change. some things will definitely change, but let's see. So I'll walk through this part in a minute. Let me just clean up some things. So this value should be only, let me get rid of that. Yes. Should be here, not here. Okay, so here the idea is similar to how we use an enum. We will use the result, but because an enum doesn't have all the information we want, like the result we want to have a value in when there is a success, or when there's an error we maybe want a message. In the future maybe something different, like a error code or something like that. For now, a message. So to implement it, we use an abstract class, and then that has the constructor that is private, or better yet, abstract class. Where is the result? I think something's missing in this implementation, but that's why. Just minimize this. Test result. Okay, this is wrong. This shouldn't happen. Let me try again. So this result should have a private constructor, or except a protected. Oh yeah, the protected can be implemented here. So, but the idea is that the result cannot be implemented by any other class for us to be able to make use of this visitor pattern. So visitor pattern I'm using here. So imagine that I'm doing something wrong, and I'm pretty sure this was okay, but I probably changed something in the code and it's broken. So this must be private. I was thinking wrong. So now if I go here and try to do a public test class test result string, now it complains about cannot access private constructor. Okay, now this is correct. So the idea here is to, because C# doesn't have a feature that other languages, namely functional languages, have, which is to, when we do like a switch case, imagine we have an enum. There are functional languages in which if you just do a switch on two, imagine that the enum has 4 values and you switch only on 2, it will give you a compilation error because you are not checking everything. And that's great for us to avoid forgetting doing things. Imagine that we throw exceptions every time we have these errors, but we wanted to actually present a specific error to the user. By using exceptions without further work, if we create a new type of exception, we won't know, so we can't adapt the result. So the idea by using this, this is not tied to the fact that it is a result. It's just a way to implement this. So the only way, all the types that implement result must be inside the class, because the constructor is private, so we cannot inherit from other places. And by doing it this way, if we create a new type, let's imagine we create here, like I had in the code here, let me copy. If we create something here, like a new, this would be a new type. I put too many, nope. Okay, so it's complaining because the visitor cannot visit this, because unexpected is not one of the types that's here in the visitor. So if we do this, and if we create a new one for unexpected, now this has no problem. And if there is any client that's using this, it will get a compilation error because it needs to implement the interface completely. So it's like a trick, because we don't have the exhaustive feature that other languages have. This is a trick to achieve that, but it's much more complex to do than having it out of the box in the language. But as we don't have, I think this is an interesting trick to do it. So now what we are going to do is change this to return a result instead of directly that thing. Over here. So now over here, this, like we saw previously, is a maybe group. Now what we can do is, if maybe group try get value out var group, if not, we can, instead of returning null, we will return a result of, not this, dot error dot not found, and say new, and we'll say that the group with ID isn't found for user ID. So instead of throwing exceptions, returning nulls, we actually use types that really mean what we want to mean. So current user, I'm never checking if the user is null or not. Maybe I should. And another thing I'm forgetting. Am I forgetting? Oh yes, the implementation. I'm forgetting implementation of the infrastructure here. I did change this to return optional group. So now what we need to do here, we do group equals and now we return, because we can't force entity framework to return an optional in here in the query handler, we need to do that. So we'll return group is null or is object. Resharper complains, but group is object will return optional some group, otherwise we will return optional none. And Rider and Resharper and all of that don't like when we use this object, but it's actually the recommended way to check for nulls, so I'll just ignore Rider. So if there's object, you can return some, and the same will probably should do the same for the user by ID. So this should be optional object user, otherwise optional none. Okay, so the infrastructure part is good. When it's a collection, no need, because a collection should never be null. It will just return an empty collection. So much. Where was I? Over here. So now we have these errors with the user. So if the group was not found, return this. If the we just yeah, if maybe current user, optional user, if maybe current user try get value, not current user, if not, we'll return another result. It could infer this, but okay. Dot error, dot not found. I imagine this can't happen because if we could find a group with the ID, it means that the user exists. But so now this will use group and current user group and result would be great if this could infer the type. Maybe it can need to. Okay, so now there is more code. This is more, it's a bit trickier. Better yet, we needed to check for the nulls. Now instead of checking the nulls, we are doing the maybe. And instead of returning null, we are returning this. Now the group's controller probably has an error because it wants to return this, but it doesn't know. But before create group, let me check. So the current user can be optional user. Okay, so we can copy that part from here. We need to change this command to return a result What's going on? What don't you like? Result. Okay, so there's no user, return that there is no user. Oops. There is no user, otherwise can continue and return result I'll need to investigate if I can find a way for this to infer instead of having to type this. Okay, but this is solved, so the domain logic is done. But we now have an error in the group's controller because it was not expecting to get results. It was expecting to, and this shouldn't be like this. This should be a result of get user It's like this, just in case we mess things up. So this returns, this is returning an optional, we'll deal with that later eventually, and the update is returning a result, checking for null, stuff like that, which is no longer needed. So what we'll do here is now we'll make use of those results, and now is where this feature of using the visitor pattern comes in handy. Let me go back to GitHub. And if we go to, we can create something that is the result mapping visitor, or in, yeah. Can minimize infrastructure and domain because it's good, and we'll create over here, don't know really where, just create a directory results, the new class called result extensions, and another we just copy paste this part and then explain. Okay, so the idea here is that instead of needing a filter somewhere to map, to grab the exceptions, map to something, we're using a result mapping visitor that implements that interface that we saw, the result visitor. And then when it's a success, we return no content when it's when we want to return the 204. Normally we want to return the 204 if there is no result, so we're using this unit, which is like a void object. And I didn't create one, but mediator uses the same thing, so we can use mediator one. Otherwise it will return 200 with the result. I'm not doing anything with collections yet. Eventually I will need to do that. Then we have for not found, we'll return a not found object result. And for an invalid, we'll do an invalid. And if we create another type of error, it will give a compilation error until we added it here as well. So we cannot forget that we created a new error, because it will not compile the web application. So besides that, we need those extensions just to make our life easier. I'll show you in a bit. So basically this is an extension over the result type, just to call the visitor using this visitor here. Let me just make a change. This is a class. I can make it a struct because I made some performance little benchmarks. And if we use a struct in here, in this code, I need to do more stuff. I'll do it later. no need to do it right now. But if we use a struct in this code, we reduce memory usage because we don't allocate as much, and because the struct will only have the value mapper inside, it will be really simple. Okay. So with these extensions, we can map easily the result to an action result or a non-action result. So now we go over here, and this is with an error, so we can just do return result dot to action result. If we want to map, okay, in that example I always mapped to something, so let's make a version of this. That doesn't have the mapper. And the mapper will be the same. So here. What don't you like? Method with same signature. It's true. But that one returns iAction result, and this one returns result. Check. But I cannot use it because it complains. And I don't need this. Okay. Okay, let's see. And now how about this one? So those extensions of course don't cover everything because I did them for another simple demo. But hopefully when watching this video you can understand why I did these things. Just to map the result to a HTTP MVC result. And like this we can just do it very quickly like this. I could even just do this. To put parentheses because of the task. Okay, so now I don't need to do ifs and stuff like that in here. We can just map it directly. And we could eventually do the same for this one. And to do that, we can just change here the, let's go to the get user group query. We'll change this to return a result. Now we get an error. And this should be result. Now the map doesn't work. or does it? Maybe group, try get value for group. Result. Not found. Can just copy the one that I used in the other place. Otherwise, we'll okay, so now we can go here, and instead of doing this, the goal of doing this was not to make the code smaller, it was just to make better use of types, but it ends up we can get both. So in this case, we are doing better use of types, and also are able to reduce some code. Reduce because we created some code elsewhere. Okay, so what's the problem here? The problem here is that we want to use something different. Now these extensions won't save us. Need to think about how to do this one. We could just do the handle create a visitor specific for this, but need to think if there's a better way, because otherwise we'll create maybe eventually too many. But we can do, this is not the best, but it can work if we do if result is result dot success we can do otherwise return result dot collection result. So we can do this. We handle the successful result manually because we want to return instead of 200, we want to return a created add action. And if it's not a success, so we're using pattern matching, checking if the result is of type result success. If it is, we return it like this. If it's not a success, we fall back to returning the automatic mapping, so we can eventually we can do some extensions, but I'm probably not going to do right now. I'll leave it like this. If in the future we have more situations like this, which is probable, I'll create like a to created at action result, and it will do this internally for reuse, but because it's the first time we have this. Okay, so I think I was able to check out two of the three topics I want to do in the next episodes regarding the making better use of type safety. So results to show the types, to results to make apparent that something may fail. There is one more thing I'm remembering. I'm pretty sure here in the entities I'm throwing an exception. And throwing an exception is not good. So over here we'll also change this to use results, but I guess it's going to be for the next stream. But I hope anyone not watching is understanding why I was doing these things, like to avoid null references and to make things clearer, and also end up with this advantage of the okay, this is not an advantage. This is basically the same as before. The other ones got smaller. But I hope it was clear, maybe not a lot, but feel free to ask questions anytime during the live streams, or when, if anyone is watching this on the YouTube archive. I'm available for questions and also for suggestions of improvement. But I guess for now I'll wrap up the stream. But this is not all done. Need to do the same over here, but the gist of it, I think I was able to try to explain why I was doing it this way, and so probably these adjustments to the results I'll do offline eventually during the next week, and in the next stream I'll probably play around with strongly typed IDs to get rid of all those strings and longs that we pass everywhere. So hope this is kind of interesting, and hope to see anyone back in the next stream. I'll try to do it again next Friday at 6 my time, so West European time. At least during the winter is West European time. And yeah. See yous.